The Marshall Islands has long been one of the most popular corporate jurisdictions in the shipping industry. There are New York Stock Exchange traded companies that are Marshall Islands corporations. So we reached out and said, hey, how would you like to expand your country's expertise from shipping into Web3 and DAOs? There was interest. And so we all collaborated on writing the first of what has now been 3 laws that we've helped write and pass, and 1 regulation. When that first law passed, we said, okay, I guess there's something here. And we started MIDAO, which stands for Marshall Islands DAO, to act as a registered agent to help people actually create and maintain these entities.
What was your impression from your talker chip? What's about the ecosystem and so on?
First of all, there are so few great DAO-focused events in the world that they're all awesome for us. It's hard to find any other concentrated place where we can find people interested in DAOs. And so that remains really valuable. And then you could still try to put events on a spectrum. I would say for DAO Tokyo, it seems like it gets a little bit more of a crowd of people that are interested in the space, but haven't actually necessarily done a lot yet. That's also reflected in what I heard about a lot of the DAOs being started in Japan are these like community organizations, like governing a local park or other shared resource, which has always been part of the vision for DAOs, but I haven't seen a lot of activity like that in much of the world. And so I think that's really exciting that people are actually doing that there. But maybe that's also why the audience maybe is a little less sophisticated, is because the projects are smaller, maybe fewer big global DAOs that are being started out of Tokyo at this time than I would hope to see in the near future.
Many of the Japanese founders who would be sophisticated moved outside of Japan for tax reasons. It was always a topic as well. So the crypto OGs really don't reside in Japan at this point, which they're trying to change with the tax law now, with the DAO laws, the changes that they make to the ordinance.
I get the sense, just a sense that in Japan, and I think someone disagreed with me about this while I was there, but I still got the sense that things seem to be a little bit government-led. So it's like the government is trying to get people, first create some regulatory clarity, and then try to get people to start DAOs, to experiment with it, as opposed to in the United States, the government is completely clueless about DAOs. Maybe if they're involved, they're hostile for the most part. But really, it hasn't even come up yet in any national conversation. And so all of the energy is coming from the private sector. And then later, it's a question of what is the government going to do about it? So that felt a little bit different too.
So it's interesting in Japan, so a bit of a tug of war between the private and the public sector. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So in terms of overall digitalization, it hasn't really worked because either side was waiting for the others to take the first steps. And so from that perspective, it's actually positive that somebody's moving. And so what the FDT has done with the Web3 white paper and putting out a comprehensive plan, putting a stake in the ground, and obviously making it also available for public comment and taking feedback into that, I think is a positive in the overall context. So one doesn't typically wake up and say, I'm creating a structure for a DAO. What is the origin story behind it for you?
I've been a tech entrepreneur my whole life. And most recently, before getting into DAOs, I was doing crypto, AI, and cybersecurity research for a large financial services company, large global firm. While I was there, I decided that I had to leave to get into DAOs full time. I had actually researched everything happening in Web3 partly for my job, and decided that DAOs were what I was most excited about, for a combination of that they're exciting in general and their promise, and also how they align with what I'm interested in and passionate about, which has to do a lot with the intersection of business and people and culture and society. And the thought that there's this new way of organizing things, anyways, made me want to focus on DAOs. But at first, I decided to start a DAO technology company. Some of my earliest clients, I noticed, were struggling with the same problem, which was the legal problem. Not legal in general, but specifically finding a legal entity that's a good fit for their structure. For example, 3 years ago, when this was going on, anywhere you go in the world, almost any legal entity that you look at, they all have some of the same requirements. So things like you have to have a board of some kind or managers. Things like you have to know the name and address of all of your members. And even those 2 things alone was enough for us to say, oh, this is interesting. There's really not a solution in the marketplace. Meanwhile, we have a relationship with a senator in the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands has long been one of the most popular corporate jurisdictions in the shipping industry. There are New York Stock Exchange traded companies that are Marshall Islands corporations. And so we reached out to the senator there and said, hey, how would you like to expand your country's expertise from shipping into Web3 and DAOs? There was interest. And so we all collaborated on writing the first of what has now been 3 laws that we've helped write and pass, and 1 regulation. When that first law passed, we said, okay, I guess there's something here. And we started MIDAO, which stands for Marshall Islands DAO, to act as a registered agent to help people actually create and maintain these entities. Now, several months later, we actually engaged in a deal with the government that mirrors what they do in the shipping industry, which is that there's actually this private company that acts almost like an extension of the registrar's office and as the exclusive official registered agent for any of these shipping companies that are based in the Marshall Islands. We followed a similar model, and now MIDAO also acts almost like an extension of the registrar's office and as the sole registered agent that can create and maintain these entities for people. So you couldn't even walk into the registrar's office and create a DAO LLC. You really have to work with MIDAO as that registered agent, as that partner in setting one up. And so that's the origin story. Just to fast forward briefly, 3 years later, we have almost 200 DAO LLCs that have signed up to create these entities with us. Most of those have been successfully registered. And we're still looking at, okay, what's the next law? What's the next regulation? What's the next policy to continue to attract business to the Marshall Islands while complying with international laws and standards?
What I found very interesting in the discussion at DAO Tokyo was dialogue between you and the gentleman from Q Protocol, because you were arguing from the same side. You're saying, if you look globally at industries that maybe operate similarly, where have a registration somewhere, but it is ultimately a global industry, it is shipping, but you came to different conclusions, and that is when you do the incorporation. And in a way, you're saying, do it up front, while Q Protocol said, keep it as far away as you can, and you use the proven method in the shipping industry with the International Court of Arbitration, which I know nothing about, but sounds very scary to me on the surface, quite honestly. You came out and said, it's a good thing to actually have an incorporation.
Yeah, and if you look at the shipping industry as a complete analogy, even though there are international bodies and norms that replace some elements of what would otherwise be handled by a country's legal system, every single project in shipping is incorporated in at least one, if not many jurisdictions. So it's not like the shipping industry has said, oh, we have our own legal structure that you can fit into without forming legal entities. You still have to form the legal entities, and you get access to this global extra legal environment. At the same time, look, since the beginning of DAOs, there's been a tension between some of the, you could call them maybe DAO maxis. It's not something I hear people saying, but to use a crypto term, or just purists that say, look, one of the things that DAOs are great for, what they make possible for the first time, is that you can have a large global digital organization without any kind of legal structure if you want to. Previously, there was no other way to have 5 even, let alone 500 people around the world collaboratively controlling a bank account or assets, collaboratively making decisions through voting without some kind of paperwork, and that paperwork being effectively like jurisdictioned somewhere. And then usually using the legal system and legal entities to enforce that agreement, right? Otherwise, you'd have just a totally unenforceable kind of arrangement. Yes, it's true that for the first time in human history, we have a way of doing that. But I think practically speaking, there's so many risks and so many downsides of operating a DAO without a legal entity today, and that might change in the long run, that it's just not practical for most people to be involved in a DAO that doesn't have a legal structure and a legal form, not to mention the fact that you're not going to be able to get a bank account, you're not going to be able to sign contracts. If you want to do something as simple as renting an office for your DAO or sponsoring an event, you're not going to be able to do those things. So there's a lot of really practical reasons why you just have to do it. Meanwhile, on the side, we can also all continue as an industry trying to develop a new model where you're not anchoring yourself in certain jurisdictions.
I have this discussion a few times with Charles Dorsey, who was at DYDX, who I would put into this DAO maxi category that you mentioned. I'm not the visionary type, I would say. I'm also having the practical consideration. And you start then listing the things of liability, bank accounts, taxation, how do you employ people, etc. The rubber hits the road pretty quickly. And those are the things that you also list out in why should I do a DAO? So why should I actually do a DAO?
Why should you do a DAO? First of all, to address the DYDX situation, there are some good reasons why, if you've been operating without a legal entity for a long time, it's really hard to create one later and wrap all your assets in it. It's mostly because of tax laws. DYDX and other large protocols that have been around for a while, if they didn't solve this problem early, they have a huge incentive, potential, depending on how you look at it, not to do it ever. The other thing is that there's a lot of middle ground between simply wrapping an entire crypto project in a legal entity and not having any legal structure whatsoever. It starts with even non-legal entity legal structures, so just contract-based structures, and even that's pretty minimal. But then it goes to, okay, maybe you have legal entities involved in the project, but you're not wrapping the whole project. In fact, almost no DAO LLC is wrapping the protocol that they built in their legal entity, right? In traditional companies, there's no difference between Microsoft software, Microsoft people, and Microsoft company. It's all one thing. But now with most DAO LLCs, the software that they're building actually lives outside that legal entity, right? It lives on the blockchain. It's not incorporated. The money flowing through it is not considered money flowing through any corporate entity, right? And so even on the other end of the extreme, in terms of how people are using these, you're not actually wrapping the whole thing. And then in the middle, you have structures where maybe you use 2 or 3 or a number of legal entities for different purposes with different assets and liabilities, different rights, different relationships to each other. So there's a lot of middle ground between someone saying, I'm not going to use a legal entity at all, and I'm going to wrap everything in a legal entity. In terms of the question of why should someone want to start a DAO or use DAO technology, to me, there's 2 ways of looking at it. One is, what does it provide to any existing organization that was not possible before, but that you could still run that organization pretty much the same way you do today and just swap out DAO and blockchain technology and get some benefits? And that benefit starts with transparency. For every action a company takes, right? And you can make exceptions, delegate something to a team, give them a budget, go do everything off chain. Fine, nothing wrong with that either. But generally speaking, at the corporate level, all of an organization's money and votes being transparent and guaranteed accurate, that's where you get to the compliance side, because you can both build rules that you know will be followed ahead of time, rather than having to go to the courts later to enforce those rules. Maybe that's a proposal period, a quorum, how the votes are counted, how you know the results of a vote. There's other risks with blockchain, like what if you lose your private key? But that aside, you've made it so that you've got a guaranteed compliant governance process, totally transparent use of money and governance. Beyond that, you're reducing the cost of governance and managing money and software compared to a traditional organization, because now, if you think about what does it take to hire lawyers and create a structure so that 1,000 people can collectively own and govern something and act on it, it's going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars, right? At least it just is, right? Unless you somehow know how to do it yourself. Even then, you're doing a bunch of paperwork, you're sending stuff all over the world for signing, et cetera. Now there's a way to, in one click, create that same structure with a built-in bank account equivalent to your treasury, with built-in governance and voting, with built-in control of software. You can launch it in one click and scale it to millions of users. And again, I know we're still working on scaling blockchains, but actually we're making great progress. But you can scale to millions of users at almost no cost. Those are the benefits in terms of, okay, have an organization that looks just like a traditional one, but swap out blockchain technology and get that transparency, compliance, and lower cost of that whole back end. Now, I think what people are even more excited about is, okay, now that you have this low cost, transparent, compliant governance and money management system or asset management system, now you can do things with governance that were impractical before. And those are things like being highly democratic. If you tried to take a normal corporation that does everything on paper, like most corporations do, and say, we're going to let the shareholders vote every week on something, whatever, approving the budget or product direction or a fee switch or just getting their input on something even, the cost of having that vote is like millions of dollars per vote. You would be spending tens or hundreds of millions of dollars a year to be a more democratic corporation. Now that you have blockchain technology and the cost of having these votes on chain is practically nothing, and you don't need to audit them, you don't need to reconcile, it's cheaper. Now you can have much more democratic forms of organization. And so a lot of the early DAOs, even up till today, are people saying, hey, what if we did something that used to be done in a much more centralized or top-down way with management, et cetera, and if we did it much more democratically? Some of them are finding that's awesome for our use case. Others are finding, oh my God, it's really hard to do things much more democratically. Maybe we need to find something in the middle. But that is truly one of the most exciting things that this technology and DAOs unlock is much more democratic forms of organization that are in some ways more like governments. But again, even governments, you can't vote every week. It's too expensive. It's too costly. No one would do it. And so even for governments, this represents a potential step forward in terms of holding more votes, having more transparency, more guaranteed compliance, and therefore the ability to actually push more power out to the edges, to communities, to people, if that's something that people want to do.
Decentralization is also a spectrum. It's not like 100% on one side, zero on the other. There are the different shades of gray in between. Just play devil's advocate, which obviously is my role. I can take 5 people, create a MIDAO, and in a way, it's a glorified multisig. Obviously, many projects also start this way and say, over time, we're going to decentralize. There's nothing wrong with this if that is a part of execution. But by itself, the DAO structure doesn't necessarily force you to be ultimately that democratic at the ground level.
Yeah, it doesn't ever force you to, but it gives you that flexibility. I don't think the future is one where every organization is going to be extremely democratic. We'll have an ecosystem of more and less democratic and everywhere along the spectrum forms of organization. Some people will wake up one day and say, I want to start and own something, and I want to do it with my 2 friends, and you can participate in it or not. They'll still be successful, but you'll also have projects in the ecosystem, in whatever ecosystem, that say, we do think there's a benefit here, that people will choose our product over that other centralized one because governance rights or whatever it is more decentralized. So yeah, you have the choice. And I think starting centralized and starting even off-chain can often make the most sense. Or to your point, maybe start with just a multi-sig with 5 people on it and a community of 1,000 people that are really excited but don't yet have governance rights. And then over time, move towards more decentralization in that regard.
From the Japan perspective, if you look at traditional financial markets, I think there are quite a number of voices that feel that the American way of quarterly earnings announcement is already way too much. It's like we rather do this once a year, and otherwise we operate in the dark, and we don't really want the sun to shine in and highlight everything. Transparency on the one side is good, but on the other side also, if you think about valuing DAOs or DAO shares, it creates even more short-termism of saying, reacting to a vote that might happen every week or every 2 weeks in terms of how, if you were trading these DAO shares, that might react to the news.
Yeah, that could introduce new challenges, but I would say the whole reason we have such restrictive securities laws, which are getting in the way of so many things in crypto, is because of the information asymmetry that usually exists between companies and their investors. Not only are they forced to do it every quarter, they're not allowed to do it in between if they wanted to, right? They're putting everyone on the same schedule, trying to make sure everyone has the same information, and it's extremely expensive and restrictive to do that. So if you now have a model where all of the information is transparent all the time, I think we won't have to follow such restrictive securities laws. I think the whole industry is just starting to take steps towards revising laws like that, creating new laws for securities regimes that make more sense for this new world. But I think that benefit of having symmetrical information for the most part across an entire economy or even just one project is going to be so much more beneficial for the world than the risk or cost of having people with really short-term attitudes. Those people will have to learn, but they'll keep playing the game. You'll have short-term people and long-term people. Long-term investors benefit a lot from the volatility that short-term investors create. And there are fewer and fewer long-term investors in the world. In fact, the finance company I work for, called Capital Group, is the largest and one of the few remaining major players in actively managed investing. So no ETFs. They manage trillions of dollars. They manage it by picking winners and losers and holding them for the long run when it makes sense. If short-termers come in and drive the price down because of something that happened yesterday that doesn't really matter that much, that's an opportunity for long-term investors. I tend to believe that those market forces cancel out the downside in the long run. But yeah, it's a new challenge to solve for as well. How do you handle a community of effectively shareholders or other things that has all the information all the time, right? What new challenges does that bring, and how do we address those?
You're calling the end of the activist investor, with many of them playing on this information asymmetry, found the edge of having a different view out of consensus view on a certain company, maybe some hidden information advantage, insider information in a way. And if all the information is out there, they can draw different conclusion, but everybody is able to. And so you create the equal playing field that ultimately is beneficial for society. I would agree with that.
We'll still have activist investor equivalents, because in some ways, the transparency and really the transferability of assets in crypto mean there's new ways for quote unquote activist investors to try to have influence or take over a project, even if it might be harder for them to have information that other people don't. The other thing too is I think those are often people, like they're in an office somewhere, their quote unquote information is just their opinions. It's based on market data that is available to everyone already. If it were based on inside information from the company, it would be illegal. Not them saying they never necessarily do that. The environment actually remains for activist investors to be just as activists.
Let's rewind a bit in terms of time. The early projects in the crypto space where the DAO concept might have been in the background but not fleshed out as it is today, how have they handled this situation?
I see a variety of approaches, ranging from some that might try to do as little as possible in terms of legal entities and just use utility entities for certain purposes. So have an entity just for the purpose of having a bank account, but it doesn't get to hold that much of the DAO's money, just holds enough so that it can transact as needed. Or have an entity to do your hiring in certain countries, which is something that other companies do too, right? You create a local legal entity because that might make it easier to hire and manage a local team. So you might just use utility entities. Some go as far as saying, look, we really need to resolve this with a grand solution. And if that means we might have tax liabilities, so be it. And we're going to wrap the entire project in 1, 2, or 3 legal entities. It's not uncommon to see a DevCo or OpCo or LabCo, a DAO LLC, and a foundation, because they serve different purposes and they each have a role to play. A lot of projects that have been around for a long time, they might already have a DevCo or LabCo or OpCo. They might already have a foundation. And so maybe now they're just adding the DAO LLC, the legal entity for the DAO. And I think everywhere in between. So I think the approaches are really varied.
MIDAO is pretty flexible in governance. While the foundation construct as it exists in Switzerland, you set it up and you can't really change it, I believe. And I'm not a lawyer, but if you want to change the purpose of what you're doing, it's virtually impossible.
The governance structure of a corporation or a foundation or an association or many of these other common forms all requires a very specific structure, because it was one that worked for a long time and puts people in positions where you can hold them liable and they have special power and special accountability, which is what people wanted for most of the history of business. You have a board, you have probably a secretary, you might have a treasurer, you might have to choose someone like a CEO. People are trying to jerry-rig DAOs into those legal forms by, for example, having an independent board of directors of a foundation that has signed a contract saying they will act in accordance with the DAO's votes. But that contract always also says, unless A, B, C, D, E happens, unless we think it's illegal, unless it's whatever, not aligned, whatever it is. To me, I come close to saying that's not really a DAO. If you want to have a person with that role, that's fine. I'm not going to say you're really not a DAO, but at least know what you're getting into. Is there a board? What's their responsibility to the DAO? Can they go a different direction if they want to? Yeah, so there's that traditional corporate form. Now, The LLC itself is an incredibly flexible legal form. It's actually the most common type of legal entity now created in the United States, but I don't think it's spread everywhere in the world. And the LLC is already incredibly flexible. You can draw up a really nuanced, complicated governance structure or way that members participate with the organization in financial or other ways, and you can achieve most of it even with any LLC. That's why I think that people, including ourselves, who wanted to create a legal entity made for DAOs, forked the LLC rather than starting over and just said, look, what we need is an LLC, but just take out the requirement to have managers, take out the requirement to know the names and addresses of your members, change a few other things down the line, reporting requirements, other stuff. So yes, the DAO LLC, like an LLC, but even more so, is incredibly flexible. And I always tell people, because it's 99% of the time or more going to be true, literally anything you can imagine or you can write down in English, you can do with a DAO LLC. There's almost no restrictions, again, unless you get into, okay, securities laws or other things that you have to follow, or not dealing with sanctioned countries, for example. Everyone has to do those things. But when it comes to your governance structure, your operations, almost anything you can imagine you can do with a DAO LLC.
When we're talking about traditional LLCs in the US context, you do an easy incorporation in Delaware. But if you're a non-US resident, then you might also want to avoid having the legal and tax exposure and all the consequences of actually being a US entity. From that perspective, you probably also chosen an offshore jurisdiction intentionally.
To us, it's funny, it was not very intentional. We identified that the Marshall Islands was a great jurisdiction. We knew a senator there from prior work we had done. We had a call scheduled and we just brought up the idea, and everything has rolled downhill from there. That said, yes, I agree with you. There are often good reasons why you don't want to have an entity in the United States to reduce your legal nexus there. But I will say, look at a different industry, venture capital. Almost every venture capital fund that is remotely global in nature has at least 2 legal entities that you can choose for your investment. One is in Delaware or somewhere in the United States, and the other is in the Cayman Islands or somewhere like it, but often it's the Cayman Islands. And they act like one fund, but literally, if you're outside the United States, yeah, you don't want to touch the Delaware entity. If you're inside the United States, you actually prefer to invest in the Delaware entity. There's no reason DAOs, if there's reasons why they need to make it compelling for investors, for example, in the same way, they might want to have at least 2 different legal entities. Or to your point, if you're going to default to one, you're probably going to choose the one outside the United States. You just want to be in a trusted jurisdiction so that Americans will still feel comfortable working with you.
In the US itself, that regulation happens at the state level. So there have been some interesting threads. Clearly, that's where competition sets in then inside the US at the state level to be innovative. There have been some states that have been more adventurous than others.
For sure. I think 5 or 6 states now have DAO LLC laws or something similar. And most US states are not competing on an international level as a jurisdiction the way Delaware or Wyoming do, but some do. It's very confusing for someone to have to follow both a state law and the related federal law, even though technically there's supposed to be a split where the corporate law is at the state level. There's still a lot of laws that apply to companies at the federal level. You are opting into 2 at once that you have to keep track of, rather than, like we always say, the Marshall Islands is the only sovereign nation to offer a DAO specific legal entity. Although actually Japan does now too. It's really just for people inside Japan. It's not for global projects. But that is a unique benefit, is that, okay, you're dealing directly with a country. So you know the entire legal system. It's all in 4 laws that you can look at. And you don't have to paste together state, federal, et cetera.
Just a side note, funny story. I had a conversation last week around stablecoins. We have stablecoin regulation in Japan, but it's also very peculiar to really the domestic market. And it's actually under the Payment Services Act. So it's not separated from the crypto regulation. And people outside Japan were saying, oh, this is not a stablecoin. And yeah, so you could argue in the same way the DAO regulation that we have is not the DAO, and it depends on what your filter, your perspective is. But from a purely Japanese perspective, that's all you got. You can't issue other stable coins somewhere else. You need to follow these 3 types that are in the regulation.
And by the way, most business that takes place in the world probably takes place locally to a country. Even though there are these massive global companies and increasingly the world is global, especially in technology, a huge amount of business takes place locally. And when your entire business or project takes place in one country, you are generally not allowed to use an entity anywhere else. You have to use a local one for tax reasons, for other reasons. And so it's really important that every state and every country does come up with its own DAO and otherwise crypto-related laws to apply to the projects that do take place exclusively there. And then you can have things like Marshall Islands, Cayman Islands, Switzerland, even Delaware, that try to address issues on a global scale. And an issue of, is it really a DAO? It's funny, it comes up a lot in the DAO community, as you probably know, in all kinds of contexts. For example, I'm in a DAO that's trying to decide a new name for ourselves after a few years of operating. And we're debating whether we want to have DAO in the name or not. All the usual issues come up. What did it originally mean? What does it mean now? Do we want to use the term only when people meet very specific characteristics of an organization or their use of technology? Or is it okay for people to use it broadly? To me, going to DAO Tokyo and seeing that the word DAO in English has become effectively a word in Japanese, and that it's being used to cover everything. It's a big tent. We can't let someone call themselves a DAO if they're really not in any way aligned with the values, the technology, the operations, any of that stuff. There may be value in saying, is it really a DAO or not? But I think generally speaking, I like the big tent approach. I like saying, look, it doesn't just mean the exact specific thing that Vitalik wrote about 4 years ago in a paper. It means all of these things that people are doing under the name DAO. I like that. That's not really a dictionary definition, but I like a definition that is as broad and inclusive as possible.
Yeah, and you always get the people who like riding on the coattails and you're selling dog food,
Right.
but now it's a dog food DAO and you think you get a higher price for your business. You can't prevent that happening.
Right. Or maybe even worse is someone trying to commit a fraud of sorts by saying it's a DAO, making you think that you have rights of some kind, because DAOs like to give their members more rights than traditional organizations. And so someone might pretend to be a DAO, use the word DAO, but there's nothing really DAO about it. Now you're kind of using it as similar, but in the same way, you're tricking people.
In the end, the work that you're doing and also what you're referring to is every country needs to come up with their own specific concept. You avoid the scenario where somebody can just create an entity that doesn't have, let's say, a registration number. I assume if I create a MIDAO, I can go to registry somewhere in the Marshall Islands with that number and actually verify that it exists. Again, it's transparency and trust but verify.
It reminds me of an interesting conversation I've had with some US law enforcement agencies. They've asked me, what do you see as the additional risks associated with your MIDAO DAO LLC? Does that somehow make it easier for people to commit fraud? And my first answer is always, and it's really what I believe the most strongly, if you're trying to commit a fraud, you probably want to avoid registering with governments and going through KYC and putting a target on your back. At the same time, I could see how, for the same reasons I'm telling everyone they should have a legal entity, maybe the fraudsters want to have a DAO that has a bank account. Now they can, whereas if they didn't have a legal entity, they wouldn't be able to do that. I certainly think it's worth analyzing the risks and for all these law enforcement agencies to be on top of it. But generally speaking, I think the world of legally registered DAOs is actually probably the people who are farthest away from wanting to commit fraud or doing anything illegal. They're the ones who are saying, I just want to fit into the global economic system that's in place today. Let me be a DAO, but also let me fit into the system, get the protections, get the benefits as much as available. And I think those people are probably the least likely to be committing fraud.
Very much agree. You brought up the dirty word, KYC. There's two parts of it. One is the money into the DAO, but then also from a Japan perspective, I believe one of the requirements is if you're actually paying out funds from the DAO, you need to know whom you're paying it to. So it can't be an anonymous wallet or so. You basically need to have the KYC on the way out as well. How does it work with the MIDAO?
For the MIDAO, first of all, when you're creating the entity and to maintain it, you have to have at least one person doing KYC with us and with the government in the traditional sense of the word. It's any beneficial owners, which is anyone who controls 25% or more of the DAO's governance rights, which is usually no one. If there are none, then any managers, which there usually are none. And then it defaults to one person has to be willing to do it, because we've got to know there's at least someone we can talk to, literally just for the purpose of communicating with the organization. And then the trade-off with the global regulatory system and with the Marshall Islands government is, in exchange for allowing the rest of the members to be anonymous, we're going to do on-chain analytics of the DAO, which, by the way, is public information. Anyone could do it anyways, but we're letting people know, look, we're monitoring your DAO on chain. We will see, even if we don't know someone's identity, we will see if their address is flagged as being sanctioned, criminal, etc. And then we can do an investigation and try to figure out if there's some wrongdoing going on, or if you have a member from a sanctioned country. There is this trade-off where, okay, yes, you can have a lot more anonymous membership than was ever possible before, but everything they do is public on the blockchain, and we can watch it and monitor it and notify the government and law enforcement if there's something bad going on. So that's in terms of MIDAO and the Marshall Islands government's KYC AML requirements. In terms of paying for stuff, yeah, it's a really good question too. In the United States, as well as Japan, it sounds like any registered nonprofit company, if they're making a donation or making a payment above a certain size, they have to file something. It's complicated paperwork. I've seen people try to fill it out. It can be very hard to do. If you're a for-profit, you're not making donations necessarily, but if you're making payments. So in the Marshall Islands, it's a little less hands-on. You have to follow the rules in any country where you're making the payment, because that's not up to the Marshall Islands. So if you're paying someone in Japan or paying someone in the United States, you do have to file paperwork with that local government associated with that donation or payment. But if you're paying someone in a country that does not have a rule that applies to paying or granting money to people in that country, then the Marshall Islands is not going to make you file any paperwork. In any case, the Marshall Islands is not going to make you file any paperwork associated with those transactions. So it's similar to how a lot of these other jurisdictions work. I shouldn't say a lot, but like Cayman Islands, I would guess Switzerland, but I don't know. If you want to attract global organizations, you often have to tell them, follow the laws wherever you're operating, but we're not going to put a whole other set of laws on top of it. If you're in the United States, you're both following the laws everywhere you operate, and you're following all those laws in the United States. You might have to report twice on someone you make a payment to. In the RMI, we're saying, okay, we're not going to require you to report that payment, but by the way, we're still saying, again, follow the laws wherever you are making them. And you're not allowed to, for example, break sanctions rules. The DAO is expected not to make payments to anyone who is on an international sanctions list. How they want to achieve that is up to them, but they could get in trouble with the Marshall Islands if it turns out they are making payments to a sanctioned individual, for example.
I need to ask the geeky question. You have baked in blockchain as a requirement for the MIDAO. So what blockchains are you supporting at the moment?
It's actually not a requirement, to be clear. So you can have a DAO LLC that does everything on paper, like a traditional LLC. You can have managers, you can know everyone's names and addresses, you can track your membership on paper if you want to. To the earlier conversation about progressive decentralization, a lot of people do, because by the time you're creating your legal entity, if you're doing it early enough to really protect yourself, you haven't even launched a token yet. You haven't put anything on the blockchain yet. You need to be able to keep track of your membership on paper in PDFs until you launch your token. And now you update your corporate documents so that you're tracking membership with a token, or you're doing governance through a smart contract. So you absolutely can do everything on paper still, but still it's a good question. The only requirement in the Marshall Islands is that any blockchain that's used for tracking membership or these other key purposes is a public open blockchain. The intention of that rule is that anyone in the world can see transparently what is happening in these organizations on chain. The question came up recently, what about ZK proofs? Because if you're doing ZK proofs, you're still on an open public blockchain. The encrypted data is there for anyone to see. But if you don't have the key to see that transaction, you're not going to be able to see it. Honestly, I'm not sure if we will be able to allow DAOs that use ZK technology to hide key things like who their members are and what transactions they're making. I'm not sure if we will be able to allow that in the Marshall Islands, or we have to think about a different way of still enforcing some kind of compliance observation on them, despite them using what is effectively a private blockchain.
You also mentioned if you have a larger organization already, you have the traditional choices of Cayman Islands, BVI, which are much more expensive to pull off as well, but you're also very likely to engage legal advice to figure out what is actually the right setup. One of the challenges is getting the word out that MIDAO is actually an option and is on the menu of these legal advisors, lawyers who help you make that decision.
About half our business comes from lawyers and corporate service providers that are possibly bringing us multiple clients over time. And then half comes from people finding us directly or from word of mouth, choosing not necessarily to hire a lawyer because you're not required to. Actually, it's one of the things that makes MIDAO less expensive potentially than Cayman Islands, BVI, Switzerland, is that all those jurisdictions and many others require you to hire a local law firm and a local independent director of some kind. And both of those things you're paying for monthly or yearly. That's one of the reasons it gets so expensive. It's a nice idea to encourage local economic development, but it's also going to price some people out of being able to use those jurisdictions. We do not have those requirements. You're not required to hire a local lawyer. There's no directors of any kind required, certainly not required to hire a local one, although you can if you want to, and there are people offering that service. I'd say the stage we're at as a business, we're still very much a startup, and we're getting close to the point where we can afford to hire a marketing person or a marketing agency, but we're not even there yet. Right now, it is mostly word of mouth, social media, showing up at events and stuff like that. By the way, we offer a referral fee. Anyone who refers business to us will pay 10% of the registration fee to the referrer. That's an offer that's available to anyone. And so if anyone knows a DAO that they can get us connected with that is thinking about legal entities or hasn't thought about it yet and just wants a briefing, we can come to community calls, we can do webinars, we can share documentation.
What's the future going to look like? You were saying you've done a few iterations, 3 laws, etc. What is on your mind next with the Marshall Islands to continue this concept?
The first thing is just continuing to get input from the legal and policy community all over the world and continue to write laws and regulations that make the Marshall Islands an even more compelling place, that address edge cases or gray areas, that address global issues in addition to local issues in any way that we can. We're going through another drafting period right now. The Nitijela of the Marshall Islands, which is their parliament, will soon be off for the holidays for a couple months. The hope is by January to have a new law and regulation to propose to them. Then I guess all I can say is that you will see other things come out of the Marshall Islands related to Web3, but I can't talk about them today. We're not rushing anything. We want to really ensure that this DAO registry is as solid as possible, but we are always talking to the government of the Marshall Islands. They have a genuine need to generate more revenue. That need comes from the fact that environmental scientists predict that literally their entire country will be underwater in under 40 years. On the big island Majuro, or the big atoll, where we spend the most time, the highest point on the island, it's 10 feet high. It's like a trash pile or something. Really, truly, this is a flat, low-laying island nation. And so they have to earn something like 20, 30, 40 billion dollars to be able to build up their land, either do land reclamation or seawalls, so that they can survive as a country. No one's coming up with that kind of money for charitable purposes. This is not only the Marshall Islands obviously facing this issue, but none of the global organizations, not the United States, no one is saying they even might be able to provide the kind of money that's needed to save their country. They're looking for revenue generation opportunities. So we talk about ideas. We talk about what are other cool things that a sovereign nation can do to drive innovation in the world in a safe and compliant manner. And maybe in the next few months, you'll hear about the next project out of the Marshall Islands.
There was something about creating a monetary authority, which apparently doesn't exist. So maybe that is something that has leaked already.
A couple projects that have been announced in the past. One was to create a new currency for the Marshall Islands, because today they use the US dollar. Is to create a new currency called the SOV, which would be a cryptocurrency. That project made some progress. You can read a lot of media coverage of it, and eventually basically got shut down by international pressure. Some of that pressure was because it was a new currency, not because it was a digital currency. It has its whole own set of considerations. Someone else recently announced that they were building a transaction payment network for within the Marshall Islands that would leverage cryptocurrency just to make it easier for merchants to accept payment from people. Those are the only ones that I know have been talked about publicly. I'm not very familiar with any progress on the transaction network, although I hope they do make progress. Hopefully, you will hear about other things coming soon.
Super. Thank you, Adam. I think that was fantastic. Excellent work. I think it's very exciting to see you leading the charge at the global scale. And hopefully, as we've seen like small steps in Japan as well, see other jurisdictions follow. Maybe then the end game is you have a MIDAO holding company and all the domestic DAOs for those who still need to incorporate a nation states underneath that holding company. That'd be cool. Best of luck. Hopefully we'll see you then at DAO Tokyo again in 2025, and we'll see what progress has been made.
Yeah, for sure. I plan on being there because I'm already missing Tokyo after just a few weeks. I haven't stopped missing it, I think, since I got back. I will plan to see you at the next one. Thank you so much for having me.